With an unbeaten streak of 32 fights across amateur and professional MMA.
16 years old.
He's going to be a superstar. He's winning competitions in all the different areas of MMA.
A 6-0 UFC record, the number 6 rank in the flyweight division, and over 1 million followers on Instagram.
Muhammad who?
Muhammad Mokaev was a man with the world seemingly at his feet at the age of just 23.
And I want to become youngest UFC champion.
And yet in the space of just one disastrous week, his entire life was turned upside down.
But Mokaev is the guy that he'd want to bring back to the UFC because he said his contract is totally done now.
He's not under contract anymore.
And a career destined for greatness thrown completely off course.
Apparently he's just a pain in the ass to deal with, and so no, we're not interested.
Thanks to a series of bad decisions and overconfidence that led to his relationship with the UFC going up in smoke. This video tells the story of the rise and fall of Muhammad Mokaev, the MMA prodigy who overcame his difficult start to life and rose to the UFC in rapid time, but now finds himself stuck in the MMA wilderness and may never achieve his dream of winning UFC gold. Let's get into the video. As you'd probably guess from his name or appearance, the story of Muhammad Mokaev began in the MMA hotbed of Dagestan, Russia. However, Mokaev's childhood was significantly different to the path his fellow UFC Dagestani fighters followed to reach the octagon. Around the age of 12, while living in Dagestan with his family, Mokaev's mother would tragically pass away, and not long after, his dad was forced to flee Russia due to political issues, taking along young Muhammad Mokaev on a journey that would see them arrive in the UK to claim refugee status. Initially settling in Liverpool, they were soon rehoused in nearby Wigan, a town in Greater Manchester. Not speaking a single word of English and living on just £36 a week in benefits, the transition to life in England was very difficult for the 12-year-old Muhammad Mokaev, but he would eventually begin to learn the language and even make friends. Unfortunately, these friends were part of the cliché bad crowd, and a teenage Mokaev was getting into trouble inside and outside of school. Sensing his kid was heading down a bad path, Muhammad's father Murad would decide to intervene and offered to pay Muhammad if he went to Wigan Youth Zone, a community hub offering sports and other activities rather than hanging around in the streets with his friends. This was an offer that Muhammad would agree to. Mokaev had dabbled in wrestling as a kid in Dagestan, but he had never enjoyed it or taken it very seriously. But ironically, his passion for wrestling was ignited at Wigan Youth Zone of all places, where he was reintroduced to the sport and took to it immediately. Unsurprisingly for a Dagestani, he was something of a natural at wrestling, and before long he was winning junior tournaments, culminating in a British National Wrestling Championship. He would also start to dabble in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, winning a European Championship in that sport. Still a teenager, it was clear that he was heading for greatness. However, it would not be greatness in wrestling as he had initially aimed for. Due to his status as a refugee, Mokaev was ineligible to compete in international wrestling tournaments and found himself at a dead end. With no way of getting to the top level of wrestling and perhaps competing in the Olympics, he would make the pivot into MMA and dived headfirst into the amateur ranks with IMAF. His intended career destination was clear and obvious, with a dream of making it to the UFC, as shown by this early Instagram message he sent Dana White, telling him he'd be in the UFC within 4 years. In an illustrious amateur career that began at the age of 15, Mokaev would rack up wins rapidly and emerge as one of the pound-for-pound best juniors in the world, winning 2 junior world championships and even landing on the radar of royalty, with an invaluable connection to Bahrain that would help his transition into the professional ranks of mixed martial arts. While garnering win after win in his amateur days, Mokaev would catch the eye of an MMA fan who posted Mokaev on his Instagram story and said the young fighter was one to watch out for. But this MMA fan was no ordinary guy. He was Sheikh Khalid, the 5th son of the King of Bahrain, and this would spark a friendship between the two and a connection to Bahrain that lasts to this day. And being good friends with the royal has its perks. When Mokaev was running into trouble with getting the documents needed to travel to Bahrain for an amateur tournament, one word to Sheikh Khalid and the entire thing was resolved immediately. The support from the Sheikh has been unrelenting ever since, with Khalid funding everything Mokaev needs for training, from access to top-level facilities or flying out sparring partners and coaches from across the world. and Mokaev regularly spends time training at KHK MMA, the Sheikh's MMA gym in Bahrain. With such a powerful backer, the transition into the professional game was a smooth one, with Bahrain-based promotion Brave Combat Federation signing Mokaev to his first pro contract, and he would make his professional debut in August 2020, winning via decision. I wouldn't usually go into too much depth on these early pro fights, but his second bout was an interesting one, as he would fight again 3 weeks after his debut, this time for UK-based promotion Celtic Gladiator, picking up another win, this time via TKO in the first round against Hayden Sheriff. Annoyingly, I couldn't find video of this fight, but his opponent in Hayden Sheriff is a somewhat notorious UK Can, whose amateur record was 0 wins and 16 losses, and his professional record stood at 0 wins and 9 losses by the time he was scheduled to fight Mokaev. Hayden has been involved in all sorts of shenanigans, such as fighting under a fake name to try and hide his record, or fighting and losing twice on the same night, but changing his shorts in between fights to try and pretend that he was someone else. In fact, he's so bad and displays such little effort that Tapology has flagged his profile for being terrible and do not count his MMA fights on fighters' records. Surprisingly though, Hayden Sheriff, with his pro record of 0 wins and 14 losses, and tons more losses not counted or recorded, has given up on MMA and instead is now doing bare knuckle boxing, where if you can believe it, his record is 2 wins and 2 losses. Here is footage of Hayden's first ever win after 31 straight defeats, with this fight ending after less than 10 seconds. I'm not blaming Mokaev here, as it was his second pro fight and more than likely the promoter booked Hayden, but it's an interesting tangent on Mokaev's second ever professional opponent. With the juggernaut that is Hayden Sheriff out of the way, Mokaev would continue to fight regularly, mostly for Brave, and quickly jumped out to a record of 6-0 just 1 year after turning professional, and his name was starting to pick up buzz. Mokaev had a lot going for him as an MMA prospect, with the hype around Dagestani MMA fighters at all-time highs thanks to Khabib, as well as Mokaev's elite amateur pedigree, his interesting backstory, and the connection he had to a core UFC market in the UK combining to make a tantalizing prospect. Add that to the fact he was 6-0 as a pro and aged just 21, it was unsurprising that the UFC would move to sign him, with a debut booked for their next event in London. In fact, they'd already been contacting him as early as his 4th pro fight, with Mokaev turning down the offer of a spot on the Dana White Contender Series, believing he had enough hype and could generate enough views that he should just go straight into the UFC rather than fighting for a contract on the Contender Series. And while his faith in his potential star power was proven correct, given he did end up going straight to the UFC. But this confidence that he was a star in the making and had leverage over the UFC was an attitude that he would hold on to throughout his career. And eventually, this confidence would turn into overconfidence with disastrous consequences for his career. But for now, he was a UFC fighter at the age of only 21, and he had a clear goal in mind.
I will hit like top 10 next year, early next year, and I want to become youngest UFC champion. So I've got like 2 years now.
In the lead up to Mokaev's UFC debut in London, I remember reading an article covering his backstory on BBC Sport and immediately being hyped to watch him and his career play out. The uniqueness of a Dagestani-born fighter proudly repping the UK made him stick out way more than the average prelim fighter. And add in the hype of his amateur background and his lofty ambitions of being the youngest ever UFC champ, and I was bought in. He was matched against Cody Durden in the first fight of the night, and he lived up to the hype with an amazing performance, landing a brutal knee to drop Durden and choking him out all inside the first minute, earning himself a performance of the night bonus in the process. Given the excitement he delivered here, it's insane to think that his career would go on to be plagued by accusations of boring fights, and I remember walking away from this fight convinced that he was going to fly through the division and win the belt. With his goal of being the youngest champ, Mokaev needed to fight as often as possible to work his way up the rankings, and 4 months later he was back in action on another London Fight Night card, this time against Charles Johnson. In contrast to his Dynamite debut, this was a forgettable fight, with Mokaev relying on his wrestling to win a comfortable decision. A win is a win, and not every fight can be a banger. So on to the next one just 3 months later, with a fight against Malcolm Gordon at UFC 280 in October 2022. I was actually in attendance for this fight, and I remember the crowd being hyped for Mokaev, given that he's Muslim and was fighting in Abu Dhabi. But the fight itself was another wrestle-heavy affair that sucked the life out of the crowd for large parts. Though Gordon was able to provide some entertainment with flashes of wrestling offense of his own. With less than a minute to go in the fight, Mokaev was able to find an armbar submission and got his third UFC win. Again, not an exciting fight, but his third UFC win in just 7 months. He was still on course to have a chance at beating Jon Jones's record of youngest ever UFC champ. But perhaps the lack of excitement from his last 2 fights was beginning to impact his hype, as heading into the next bout, again held in London, his fight was lower on the card than 2 UK fighters making their UFC debuts, neither of whom was considered a better prospect than Mokaev. Had the UFC's faith in his ability to generate interest already diminished? Who knows, but he needed an emphatic win against Jafel Filho to get the hype train back on the tracks. Unfortunately, Mokaev wasn't able to deliver the kind of performance that he was hoping for, but there was an incredible moment in the 3rd round when Mokaev was caught in a knee bar for almost a full minute. But despite insane pressure and Mokaev hearing 6 or 7 cracks in his knee as the submission was applied, he refused to tap and remarkably was able to escape before finding a submission of his own to win the fight. This remarkable sequence did light up the crowd after the first boring 2 rounds, but it wasn't the kind of win that suggested Mokaev was ready to challenge for the belt. Given the damage to his knee, there was worry he could be facing a significant injury layoff, but he was able to escape with just a partial MCL tear that required 2 months of rehab, something of a lucky escape. 4-0 in the UFC, he would return in October 2023, 7 months after his last fight, and now seemingly running out of time to beat Jon Jones's record, given he needed to win the belt in less than a year. Number 10 ranked flyweight Tim Elliott was the opponent this time, and Mokaev needed to make a statement here and absolutely starch him to start rapidly climbing the flyweight rankings. But it was the same old story, a Mokaev 3rd round submission win in another largely uneventful fight. He was winning fights and finishing them, and was unbelievably skilled for such a young age, but his style wasn't one that was resonating with casual fans, and this fight wouldn't have done much to encourage the UFC to push him hard if they were having doubts already. The UFC is supposed to be the place where the best fight the best, but there is no question that there is an expectation from the UFC to be an entertaining fighter if you wish to gain Dana White privilege, and Mokaev hadn't earned his yet. Typically, just winning fights at such a young age would have been enough to keep Mokaev's relationship with the UFC sweet, but unfortunately Mokaev is a flyweight, a division Dana White notoriously dislikes, and thus he would have to do more than just win to really impress the UFC. And although we didn't know it yet, Mokaev was not only failing to impress the UFC in the octagon, he was also proving to be a real headache outside of the octagon, with matchmakers apparently disliking working with him. Though none of this would come out to the public until later down the line. And in the build-up to his next fight, Mokaev would get into trouble outside of the octagon, with a beef starting that would eventually culminate in a significant contribution to his downfall and release from the UFC. Mokaev was booked to face Alex Perez at the UFC Apex in March 2024, and while in Vegas, he would encounter fellow flyweight contender Manel Kape at the PI. For whatever reason, this led to a full-blown argument that got physical, with Kape apparently attacking Mokaev with a headbutt, leaving Mokaev with a cut on his forehead just days before his fight with Perez. This altercation didn't leak at the time, but behind the scenes there was now understandably a simmering beef between the two. Though for now Mokaev needed to focus on fighting Alex Perez, as he desperately needed to jolt some hype back into his career to rebuild the UFC's faith in him. In fact, Mokaev himself was targeting a big performance and felt that an emphatic win would warrant a title shot, given that Pantoja had already cleaned out most of the other contenders. But, and it feels like I've said this 5 times at this point, Mokaev was not able to deliver what he was hoping for. Yes, he picked up the win, but this was a very close and frankly boring fight. It took place in the UFC Apex, which never helps a fight feel exciting. but the entire fight just felt inconsequential, and Mokaev spent large parts trying to bait illegal knees by crouching with his hands on the mat. By now, the hype that I felt from his electric debut had completely evaporated, and I feel like many other fans felt the same. Despite putting together a 6-fight win streak and climbing through the flyweight division at an extremely young age, Mokaev was heading into the last bout of his UFC contract with pressure on him to save his UFC career. A bizarre scenario for such a talented young fighter. Delivering several boring fights in Dana White's least favourite division had put Mokaev in a precarious position with the UFC, and it was apparent that Mokaev's value in the eyes of the UFC was not very high given how little push a 12-0 23-year-old prodigy had gotten to this point, fighting low down on cards even when the event was taking place in his home market of the UK, and he had failed to deliver when fighting near the top of the card in the UFC Apex. In the aftermath of his somewhat disappointing performance against Alex Perez, where many had expected Mokaev to get the finish and head for a title shot, Mokaev himself seemed to sense that he had not delivered the exclamation point on the W that would have granted him his shot at UFC Gold. And he would make the surprising decision to head to Twitter and announce that he didn't deserve the title shot and instead wanted to fight Brandon Royval to try and prove himself. Going down the humble route and accepting he hadn't delivered might have been a good strategy for Mokaev, as with one fight left on his deal, the UFC almost certainly wouldn't have given him a title shot anyway, even if they could keep him in the UFC on a champion's clause. With his dream of becoming youngest UFC champion dead in the water, perhaps Mokaev was now willing to wait for his shot and was sensing that the UFC were not particularly enamored by him. Mokaev began to publicly campaign for the Royval fight on Twitter, but Royval for his part said he'd rather fight for the title and labelled Mokaev a boring fighter.
By the time he fights again, I always just forget what he brings to the table, and then I watch him like, oh yeah, this kid's fucking boring.
Given Mokaev had ruled himself out of a title shot, it should have been unsurprising to him when a week later he wasn't given a title shot. But the announcement that Steve Erceg would be fighting for the title did seem to come as a shock to him, as he would once again take to Twitter to express disbelief that Erceg had gotten the shot, as well as giving an interview to TalkSport in which he played the victim and said the UFC was deliberately delaying him, but they couldn't deny him forever. Now I understand why he's upset, because he definitely had a better case for a title shot than Erceg, who had 3 wins in the UFC compared to Mokaev's 6, but you lose any sympathy or case to complain when literally 1 week ago you publicly announced that you didn't want the title shot. And acting as if there's a UFC-wide conspiracy designed to stop you from getting the belt is a bad move when you're 1 fight away from free agency and haven't shown any ability to draw enough interest to have any leverage over the UFC. The hype behind him had already dimmed, and the last thing he needed was creating beef with the UFC over a situation that was completely his own fault. With the title shot gone and the fight with Royval not forthcoming, Mokaev was desperate to fight on the UFC 304 card in Manchester. And the UFC would tee him up with a great opportunity to finally generate some buzz and make a statement win by setting up a bout with Manel Kape, the same fighter who cut him prior to his fight with Perez. Perhaps the spark of their existing beef could help deliver an engaging build-up and a great fight in front of a home crowd that was sure to get behind Mokaev. The perfect ingredients for Mokaev to make it unquestionable that he deserved the next title shot at flyweight and he deserved a new contract. Instead, however, Mokaev's UFC 304 experience would be disaster after disaster that would see his stock hit the absolute floor, with his life turned upside down in a matter of days and his future in MMA thrown up in the air thanks to his own poor decisions. With UFC 304 being held at the new Co-op Live Arena in Manchester, this was effectively a hometown show for Mokaev, given he trained in Manchester and lived nearby in Wigan. A massive opportunity for him to build up some much needed support and buzz. And it was buzz he desperately needed, with the UFC brass unimpressed with Mokaev. even to the extent of making it clear in conversations with him that they wanted to see more striking and more entertainment from him if he wanted to stay in the UFC, making this an even more important fight than it already was for him. His future in the UFC was in jeopardy. And yet with all of this on the line, Mokaev would make an inexplicably stupid decision prior to even weighing in. In their scuffle in Vegas, Manel Kape had left Mokaev with a visible cut after a headbutt, and this was something that Mokaev had not forgotten. But seemingly, Mokaev was willing to be the bigger man heading into their fight, as he sought out Kape in the fighters' hotel for a photo to squash the beef in the name of Islam, with both fighters being Muslims. Kape agreed for the photo, but when he tried to greet Mokaev, he was sucker punched and jumped by Mokaev and his team, with a brawl breaking out in the hotel, part of which was captured on camera and circulated on social media. There was no two ways about it, this was a really bad look for Mokaev. Yes, it was revenge for Kape's attack in Vegas, but by going out of his way to sucker punch Kape in fight week, he not only jeopardized their fight being able to go ahead, but he generated the UFC negative press, as well as causing issues with the hotel and forcing the UFC to take extra precautions in fight week to keep Mokaev and Kape apart. A lot of hassle for a fight scheduled to take place on the prelim card. This was a beyond stupid decision for a fighter who was rightly or wrongly in the last chance saloon with the UFC, and it was clear that they were absolutely not impressed by this behavior. As a result of the hotel scuffle, the fight between Mokaev and Kape was moved even further down the card, ending up on the early prelim section, signaling that Mokaev was heading towards the UFC exit door unless he could dramatically swing things in his favour during the fight. It was now beyond clear he needed to deliver the highlights the UFC were asking for, and anything less could see his UFC dreams go up in smoke. The simmering beef between the pair did have the potential to help the fight catch fire, especially as it looked extremely real given Kape was accusing Mokaev of using religion to trick him into posing for a photo before getting jumped, and this tension carried through to the weigh-ins where they had to be separated again. As someone who always gets sucked in by beef, whether it's real or fake, this animosity between them definitely piqued my interest in the fight more. And judging by the comments on the weigh-in, I'm not the only one, as people were asking why the fight was stuck on the early prelims and wishing that the fighters had been at the press conferences. The hotel incident had put him on the back foot, but the mission was simple: put on an entertaining fight, get the win, sign a new UFC contract, and start preparing for a flyweight title shot. Easy as that. Instead, we got, well, dog shit. And it's a shame because right up until the last possible minute, it seemed like we were going to get a real scrap between two fighters who genuinely disliked each other. As security had to step in and separate them before the bell had even rung, such was the animosity. You can even hear the crowd getting into it, despite just how early into the card this fight was placed. Then the bell rang and we were treated to one of the most disappointing UFC fights I have ever seen, given the supposed tension in the build-up. We went from a cage filled with security to stop them attacking each other before the fight, to fans booing after just 3 minutes, and referee Mike Beltran trying to encourage them to engage each other in a first round where genuinely nothing of substance happened apart from a handful of leg kicks and then a late flurry from Kape in the final 20 seconds of round 1. I sympathise with Mokaev somewhat, as he's known for his wrestling and Kape is a great striker, but at the end of the day, if your UFC career is on the line, you can't have a first round so boring that fans are booing and the ref is demanding you engage, especially after you hyped up fans with your heated build-up. Round 2 started with a bit more action, and Mokaev got a huge break in the first minute when Kape broke his toe. With his opponent now compromised and his career on the line, surely Mokaev would pour it on and go all out for a finish, right? No, of course not. Mokaev instead landed a takedown and then proceeded to blatantly cheat right in front of the ref by pulling Kape's shorts down, forcing Mike Beltran to stop the fight and give away Mokaev's position for cheating so brazenly. And really, he should have taken a point away too. Mokaev even got chewed out by the ref for completely ignoring him as he was explaining the decision to him. The rest of round 2 saw Cap, with his broken toe, being the one to try and press the action, with Mokaev running away and trying to avoid engaging, though Mokaev did land an eye poke that I think was accidental. The bell sounded, and somehow round 2 had proven to be even worse than the first round for Mokaev, as there was again barely any action outside of his blatant cheating. Due to how little volume there was, these rounds were extremely hard to score, and there's no way Mokaev could have been sure that he was 2-0 up, so really, he needed to pour it on in round 3 to win the fight and to try and rescue his reputation with the UFC. So what did he do? Well, Mokaev spent the first half of the round on the back foot, avoiding Cap again before landing a takedown. He didn't do much of anything with the takedown, and then ended the final round by channeling his inner Max Holloway and pointing to the middle of the octagon, inviting Cap to bang it out, only for Mokaev to essentially do nothing. It's like he was going out of his way to prove the boring fighter allegations were completely correct. The final bell sounded to almost no reaction from the crowd, and even when Mokaev hopped on the cage to celebrate, his hometown crowd were in dead silence, something that seemed to shock even Mokaev, who had either overestimated his star power or underestimated just how boring the fight had been. But Mokaev was the man to get his hand raised in another close fight that probably should have been a draw if Mokaev was rightly deducted a point for the blatant shorts grab. A win is a win, but as we've already established, Mokaev needed more than a win here. And outside of getting his hand raised, he failed in every other conceivable metric between his hotel antics, his boring fights, and his blatant cheating. But Mokaev wasn't done taking L's there, as his post-fight press conference would also prove to be interesting. He first decided to openly admit that he had sucker punched Cap in the hotel, something that wasn't known to the public yet.
So I told him, let's come take picture. And once he came, I dropped him, and I had to do it.
Interestingly, he was then asked if he wanted a title shot next, but perhaps sensed his place in the UFC was possibly gone, as in his answer he didn't even mention the title shot, instead begging Dana White for a new contract.
Yes, I want to fight for the belt, and I hope UFC give me a new contract. I'm finished, my contract is finished with UFC. I hope they give me a new contract.
And given what comes shortly after this clip, Mokaev would show a stunning lack of self-awareness when he claimed that Dana White and the rest of the UFC top brass loved him, even if he wasn't delivering the highlights they wanted.
Hunter, Dana, Mig, they love me, you know, they have good relationship with me, but they just want highlights. Let's be realistic, they want highlights, KO, knockouts, the views. Bring like pay-per-view, get money for the organization. This is their business. They want best for them. If they kick me out, they find another guy, I believe.
A bit weird to claim they loved him if they'd openly told him he wasn't getting a new contract unless his fights improved. Watching this post-fight presser, I think Mokaev perhaps naively believed that even though the fight was boring, by keeping it mostly on the feet and getting the win, he'd done enough to be offered a new contract. But if Mokaev was hoping for a new deal, a certain pissed-off tomato was about to turn his life upside down after a decision-filled card had already put him in a really bad mood. A reporter brought up Mokaev, saying the UFC had told him to stop going for takedowns or he'd be cut, and Dana White was quick to deny this, while suggesting there were other reasons why Mokaev wasn't popular with matchmakers.
I'm sure one of the matchmakers probably said something to him or whatever, but yeah, the matchmakers aren't big fans of his for many different reasons, and not just there's a lot of people who shoot takedowns in this business. You know, a lot of guys that fight with that type of style, but it's a lot more than just that.
And when pressed on whether Mokaev would get a new contract, Dana White dealt an absolute hammer blow.
He's not under contract anymore.
Okay. But would you be interested in, you know, keeping him around in the fall?
I think the PFL is going to get a great undefeated guy.
Really?
Good luck to him.
The fight week had been a complete disaster for Mokaev from start to finish, other than getting his hand raised. And he now ended it knowing that he was heading for free agency after being shown the door by the UFC in brutal fashion. It was interesting that Dana White had specifically mentioned PFL as Mokaev's next promotion. And not long after that, rumours circulated on social media that Mokaev had been negotiating with PFL while under contract with the UFC, and that this had contributed to his release. However, this was claimed untrue by both Mokaev and his manager, and it doesn't even make sense as the PFL doesn't have a flyweight or even bantamweight division for Mokaev to compete in. Instead, it seems like a combination of his boring fighting style and a bad attitude behind the scenes, while fighting in the UFC's least favourite division meant that Mokaev was expendable, and the UFC had no desire to work with a difficult fighter who wasn't making them any money. It's one thing to be a headache for Dana White if you're someone like Sean Strickland headlining cards, but it's another when you're a guy fighting on the Fight Pass early prelims. And the extent to which Muhammad Mokaev had been a headache to deal with behind the scenes would begin to become clear in the days following his unceremonious departure from the UFC. His release as an unbeaten prospect understandably generated headlines, and before long, many in MMA were asked for their thoughts about the situation. And one of those asked was Steve Erceg, the man who'd gotten the title shot against Pantoja after Mokaev said he didn't want it. And Erceg would give an interesting reply that shone a new light on Mokaev and his attitude.
I saw it when I fought on the same card as him, just the way he was treating the nutrition team and that sort of thing from the UFC. And just like little things that's like disrespectful that, yeah, I thought was odd, but he's a young kid, hopefully he'll learn from there.
Mokaev would deny this and claim that he had a great reputation with the UFC staff. But then again, this is the same guy who said Dana White loved him just hours before Dana White cut him and told him to go to PFL. So it's possible that his perception was off. Other small incidents like Mokaev being disqualified from a local BJJ tournament for slamming an opponent twice only added fuel to the fire around his attitude, with a view starting to emerge that he was a difficult personality. And that would be supported by the next man to comment on Mokaev, none other than Ray Sifo, the president of PFL who Dana White had suggested should sign Mokaev now that he didn't want him anymore. Sifo was asked about signing Mokaev and made it very clear that they had no interest in signing him as they'd heard about his reputation.
No, actually, you know, I've spoken to people that is in the know, and apparently he's just a pain in the ass to deal with, and so no, we're not interested.
As mentioned before, PFL doesn't have a flyweight and bantamweight division, so it's not surprising they weren't interested, but the venom behind the response was surprising and suggests Mokaev was guilty of behind the scenes shenanigans not known to the fans that had ruined his reputation. The MMA world was collapsing in on Mokaev, and for a guy who'd come up in the sport dreaming of fighting in the UFC, it must have been a very humbling few days. He would try putting on a brave face on Twitter by thanking the UFC for the opportunity, but it wasn't long before his desperation for another chance became apparent as he begged to fight for free if the UFC gave him another chance.
I said to Hunter Campbell, I said, whatever I've done at the hotel, I'm ready to pay for that and fight next fight in UFC for free, whatever trouble I made.
But despite claiming to have learned his lesson and making it clear how badly he wants to be back in the UFC, there has been no movement on a return, and it seems the UFC has no interest in bringing him back, with Dana White seemingly unmoved even after Mokaev has offered to fight for free, and reiterating that he was a backstage headache disliked by UFC staff.
Of course nobody's going to fight for free. People can talk all the shit. People can talk all the shit they want about how we pay, but nobody's fighting for free. It is what it is. I always say this, that this is an opportunity to be here and to perform in front of the entire world. And, you know, he's just a guy that did everything wrong and pissed these guys off. I wasn't involved in any of the stuff that happened with him, but, you know, the matchmakers and Hunter were, and they weren't happy with him. They weren't happy with the way he acted. They weren't happy with a lot of things he did and said, and, you know.
Given his obvious talent, Mokaev did have multiple other lower-level promotions interested in him, including Brave, Karate Combat, and Rizin. But it was clear from his offers to fight for free, and the numerous apologies he offered, that the only opportunity Mokaev really wanted was a second chance with the UFC. To add insult to injury, while he was looking for a new promotion, Mokaev was recently involved in a serious car accident back in Dagestan, where he was thankfully able to escape without serious harm, but damn, his luck was really not in at the moment. However, there was finally some good news for Mokaev that was announced recently, although it may be bittersweet given the direction his career has gone. Mokaev announced publicly that he had re-signed with Bahraini promotion Brave CF, the same promotion he'd begun his career with. Given his connections to the royal family, I have no doubt he will be well compensated during his time with Brave, but it's a major disappointment to see Mokaev go from on the verge of a UFC title shot to falling all the way back down to the first step of his career so quickly. Mokaev's MMA career at the top level is certainly not over, with even PFL seemingly backtracking and suggesting they might be open to signing him after all. However, his dreams and ambitions of becoming a UFC champion have hit a massive roadblock. And when you're dealing with someone as stubborn as Dana White, you never know if you'll ever actually be allowed back to the UFC. Mokaev is a boring fighter, but we have seen boring fighters stick around in the UFC and even win titles as recently as this year. Unfortunately, his real crime seems to have been being a pain in the ass outside of the octagon while generating no buzz inside the octagon. A death sentence for a UFC fighter competing in Dana White's beloved flyweight division. Aged 24, Mokaev has plenty of time to turn things around, and this saga may end up being nothing more than a blip on a legendary career. Hopefully he will learn from the mistakes he made during his time in the UFC and bounce back stronger than ever. Given the trajectory his career was previously on, I wouldn't bet against him one day winning the UFC gold that he's been chasing since he was just a child. The end. Thanks so much for watching the video. Please like and subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and check out my last video on the Indian fake record fraud who lied his way to the UFC. If you like football or American football, check out my other channels linked in the description below, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.